On a morning when the sun hit the sugarcane like a hot blade, and the air tasted of dust and stale cachaça, Jonas stood beneath the low eaves of the casa grande and watched the world move in rhythms that were not his to command. The rooster crowed, a dry rasp that bounced off the lacquered wood. The scent of coffee rose from the kitchens and mixed with the sour reek of the pigsty near the chiquero. Jonas was 28, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose hands told every story he did not speak aloud. He carried the lines of the senzala under his skin and the quiet stubbornness of someone who had learned to count his breaths. He had come to the Fazenda as a child and had learned to read the sun, to read the whip, and to read the faces of those who pretended no violence existed. He believed with a deep and dangerous tenderness that memory was a muscle that could not be sold. If this story touches you, leave a like and do not let it fall silent, because what follows will ask who owned not only the land but the bodies that tilled it. In the house yard, the flagstones still held the faint shape of boots. The wind played with a loose shutter, and somewhere inside a bell sounded like a bensol, more for the house than for the people who lived beneath its shadow. Jonas was born in a wooden room that breathed insects and moonlight, a room where his mother sang to the orishas quietly under her breath, while the capataz passed by and pretended not to listen. He remembered the smell of boiled cassava and the feel of his brother Marcos' shoulder when they lay awake and listened to the distant laugh of the Coronel at the table inside. His childhood was a ledger of small privations and larger cruelties. When he was 10, he learned to mend a harness and how to carry a cangaya across his back without complaint. When he was 13, he learned the names of nights when the cangaceros rode through the hills and the owners locked their doors tighter, praying to saints they never kept company with by day. There was a seam in his memory where tenderness and pain met. His mother, Rosa, had a laugh that could soften the hardest ox, and an old midwife named Maria taught her to press a crumb of bread into a newborn's fist as if feeding hope itself. Jonas kept a small book, a scrap bound with twine, with a scratched list of names the way a map marks sacred ground. That book was a secret he folded into the lining of his shirt, under the coarse fabric where the rain could not reach it. He read the dates by the flicker of a stolen candle, learning to remember beyond the immediate need to survive. Childhood had given him a sense of duty not demanded by the owners, but born of mutual care, a duty to those like Anna, his wife, to little Isabel, and to the silent promise that a name must outlive the market. The owner of everything, at least on paper, was called Elias Moreau, and everyone called him Coronel. He moved through the Fazenda like a rumor, polished boots and a smile that never reached his eyes. The Coronel kept a small Bible beneath the pad of his arm, and a ledger heavier in his study. And while he said words about providence, he kept other inventories where names were numbers. He had assistants who dressed better than many of the free men in the town. Pedro was the capataz, a man with a hawkish nose and a voice that could split a quiet morning. Joaquin worked the stables and wore a permanent shadow on his jaw. Duarte, the blacksmith, lived in a hut near the river and at times hosted secret conversations. Ana, the washerwoman, sang sagas into soup pots. Father Miguel said Mass and offered benson, while his ledger remained clean of inconvenient confessions. The house grande had a strict choreography. The Coronel defined the limits of speech. The servants, the overseers, the townspeople, and the men in the senzala all learned where to stand, where to bow, and whom to fear. Power was not only the whip or the sail. It was the daily insistence that someone else decided whether you woke or slept, lived or were sold. The contrast between Jonas and the Coronel was a gulf. Jonas bore scars that were private. The Coronel wore his cruelty like a coat. The rules of this microcosm were clear, and they echoed laws beyond the fences. A man could be sold as easily as he might be given a favor.
and the porch lights of the Casa Grande made the night's darkness look like a consent. One humid night, when the moon was a pale coin, a noise broke the routine and set fate in motion. The Coronel had been away at a meeting in the county seat, his absence stretching the household thin with opportunity. In the kitchen, Maria whispered plans. Jonas had been asked to fetch a satchel from the storehouse. In the dim corridor, he saw, on a side counter, a ledger left with reckless care. His mouth went dry. He touched the paper, the edge still warm from use, and read names that trembled with future weight. The ledger listed sales, prices, names crossed out, and beside one line, the Coronel had scrawled a word that felt like ice. Sale pending. Jonas understood quickly, and the room turned slow. He wrapped the ledger under his shirt and heard footsteps. A voice, not yet angry, asked his name. Jonas turned. Jonas said, "I should not be here." Pedro said, "You were ordered." Jonas said, "I found this by mistake." Pedro said, "Leave it then and go fetch the satchel." Jonas said, "It belongs to
the house, but it belongs to people too." Pedro said, "Your kind need their business left alone." Jonas said, "My kind are not things." Pedro said, "Watch your tongue." Jonas said, "Will you sell my brother Marcus too?" Pedro said, "The colonel will decide." Jonas said, "If you sell him, you sell me." Pedro said, "Then you are a liar who will wish to be quiet." Jonas said, "If you sell me, remember my mother's Benson." Pedro said, "Remember the whip instead." The exchange bent the night. Pedro left and the ledger burned a map in Jonas's chest. He understood then that knowledge could be a wound, that the powerful would try to cauterize with law and ledger. That is the moment everything tilted. Jonas could have returned the paper and let the world slide back into its set pieces. Instead, he kept the ledger, hid it in the lining of his shirt, and made a choice that would echo for months. That small theft was not theft so much as an opening of a shutter. The room smelled of starch and sweat, the candle guttered, and outside a dog barked like a tired conscience. It was the first violation and also the first act of claim. When the ledger surfaced, a rumor spread like spilled grain, and the community fractured. Some, like Ana the washerwoman and Duarte the blacksmith, took Jonas's side. Ana brought him warm bread and whispered prayers to the orishas. Duarte filed a knife and looked at the horizon as if deciding whether to cross it. Maria and Joaquim counseled caution, saying that survival was often about what one chose to keep hidden. Others, like Father Miguel and a woman called Señora Beatriz, who managed the house supplies, pretended to be shocked, and then found it easier to join the chorus that called for order. Isabel, the colonel's daughter, who had grown up with Jonas on sight lines and small kindnesses, sat silent and watched faces. The town mayor, Manuel, told the colonel that rumors could ruin commerce. A young clerk called Tomas was heard repeating the ledger entries to anyone who would listen. A mason named Francisco said he had always mistrusted the House Grande. There were arguments by the well, whispered counsel at the cementerio gates, and a slow gathering of voices. People clenched vasoras and sharpened the edges of courage in the dark. In public, the majority spoke the language of propriety and punishment. In private, some wondered whether the ledger might bring a bolder justice. This reaction forced Jonas to reckon with not only the Coronel, but with the precariousness of any support that could be bought or broken by fear. At roughly the point when choices hardened into consequences, a new scene opened. The Colonel returned abruptly and called Jonas to the study. The room smelled of lemon oil and old paper. The Colonel did not raise his voice at first. He used small questions like needles. This confrontation grew to something sharp and had to be recorded in the ledger of memory. The dialogue that followed unfolded like a trial in miniature. Coronel Elias said, "You were born here." Jonas said, "I was born under a roof that never asked me my name." Coronel Elias said, "You know your place." Jonas said, "Place is not the same as destiny." Coronel Elias said, "Destiny, like property, is a matter of title." Jonas said, "Whose title? Yours on paper and on skin?" Coronel Elias said, "You hold talk that undermines order." Jonas said, "I hold the truth in my hand." Coronel Elias said, "Give it to me." Jonas said, "I will not gift what belongs to people." Coronel Elias said, "You speak of people as if they are papers with signatures." Jonas said, "They are voices that remember." Coronel Elias said, "I decide who remembers." Jonas said, "You decide what to destroy." The argument escalated. The coronel threatened sale, a word that fell like a slab of ice. There was talk of relocating men to distant markets, breaking families, and of punishment meant to erase the idea that a man could claim his humanity. The capataz stood by with a rope half hidden. Pedro's jaw set. Jonas felt a pressure in his throat that was not only fear, but a furious refusal. He confessed, to the coronel and to himself. The ledger remained with him. The room smelled then of lemon oil and iron, and there was a promise of the chicote if he did not yield. The decision landed. Jonas would be punished, and a negotiation would follow. That moment of tension lasted into the night and folded itself into the larger decision to sell, to exile him from the only home he knew. A small and necessary pause here. If this scene has moved you, you are not alone. Stories like this occupy the dark places of history and ask us to name our feelings. Tell us in the comments one word that this moment stirred in you. Anger, sorrow, shame, hope. Your single word helps others find themselves and guides which stories we should tell next. Your voice in the comments keeps memory alive and supports a community that refuses to let these names vanish. Now we return to the tale and to the choices that followed that night, because what the coronel decided would reach far past Jonas. The punishment came as a kind of exiling ritual. They bound Jonas not only with rope, but with the idea that his body could be moved like a crate. Anna pressed her forehead to his and whispered a benza that smelled of rosemary and smoke. Marcos was taken aside and told to be quiet. Pedro read the terms of the sale as if reciting scripture. Joaquim helped bring a trunk where they put Jonas's small book, his secret ledger, and a threadbare shirt. Duarte gave him a small hammer, a useless consolation, and Father Miguel offered a prayer that found no solace. The morning was heavy with flies, and the river sounded like a heartbeat. Jonas touched the wooden post where his name had been carved as a boy and thought of the Quilombo stories Duarte had told, islands of people who kept other laws. Those stories became a map in his head. On the day of departure, he walked the paths he had trod 1,000 times. He kissed Anna in front of the well, where the water tasted like iron and moss. Isabel, who had once stolen a ribbon from the house grande to give him, held a small charm in her fist. Manuel, the mayor, pretended not to cry. Señor Beatriz pinned a white handkerchief on his collar with shaking fingers. There were no real goodbyes, only transactions. The cart that would carry him rolled on slow wheels that smelled of grease and old rope. Jonas carried his small book and the ledger, both folded close to his heart. As the fazenda receded, its chimneys turned into small black teeth on the horizon. The land that had been his world and also his prison lay behind him like a page turned. 1 month later, the news traveled like a rumor about embers. In the village, there was talk of a man sold to a plantation across the river, a place where language had a different cruelty.
Anna worked at the wash-house and kept a place at the table for him whether he returned or not. Duarte had started to whisper of organizing, visiting the free men at dusk with small proposals. Father Miguel, pressed by his own conscience, said a mass for the souls lost to the ledgers, and some began to leave flowers at the cementerio gate in a small, secret vigil. The Coronel continued his life with measured steps, but when he walked alone, the mirror in his study no longer reflected the certainty he had once worn. The ledger had been lost to him, and that fact became a tiny wound of irritation. 3 months after Jonas left, a petition began circulating. It was primitive, names scrawled in the margins, signatures that were sometimes a cross or a smudge. Ana and Maria and Duarte collected names and smuggled them through a network that remembered how to keep secrets. The petition demanded an accounting, asked the county to legalize a review of certain sales. Manuel was frightened, but Tomas the clerk leaked the petition to a sympathetic lawyer in the town. The small group met by the river and practiced speeches that were meant to sound civilized but had the force of truth. Isabel learned to carry the story forward like a torch. The Coronel felt the pressure of gossip coalesce into law, and for the first time he had to answer publicly for what had been private. 6 months later, a slow justice edged into place, not as a grand revolution, but as a stubborn, bureaucratic irritation. The petition had reached authorities.
And a review was ordered. The names in the ledger were checked. Some sales were annulled on technicalities. Jonas himself remained far away, but the record of his being had been made. Duarte had led a small work stoppage which had forced the overseers to negotiate. Anna had found a way to send a letter folded into clean linen, and the letter found Jonas. He read it by a peerless light in a lean room and wept quietly, not from relief, but from the knowledge that memory had moved into procedure. Father Miguel had resigned quietly from some of his duties and started to preach with more clear conscience. The Coronel faced the county magistrate and found his ledger read aloud. The community had begun to map its own dignity. In the end, Jonas did not return as a conquered man, nor as a hero in any tidy narrative. He returned many years later, older in ways that were not only measured by days, with hands that had grown both rougher and more careful. The book he carried, once secret, became a small testament that others read and added to. The senzala had been altered, not fully erased, but some rooms were turned into shared spaces. A small school was founded by Duarte and others who taught reading not for papers, but for people. The Coronel died with disputes unresolved and a tarnished name. The ledger had been both weapon and mirror. People still use the word sale as a scar across evenings. The Quilombo stories persisted in new forms, as plans for mutual aid and as songs hummed while washing clothes. The tiny rituals, the bensam at dusk, the offering to the orishas by Maria, the dusting of a grave in the cementerio, these continued as acts of remembering. Jonas planted a small tree near the well, an act of claim that needed no permission. Memory became a public thing that could not be easily auctioned. If this tale moves you, do not let it be a private ache. Share one word in the comments that this story left in you. Inscribe it in that communal ledger so that the names of those who endured are not reduced to margins. Subscribe if you believe these voices deserve careful telling. We tell them not to punish the dead, but to teach the living how to hold their tongues and their hands differently. Remember that ownership can be legal and yet morally bankrupt. Remember that people were never property. Remember the names.